So there's a new trade deal, the USMCA, which a lot of people are heralding as the new NAFTA. And I guess that time limit is something like 16 years. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if that has removed some of that uncertainty and perhaps, I guess, restored some investor confidence in Canada.
For sure. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of like if I put my boot on your neck and then I remove it, that's a good thing because you're feeling less pain. But in another sense, we have a lot less uncertainty than we had 6 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago when no one knew for sure what was going to happen next. But I don't know if there's jubilation in the streets as a result of having the USMCA, which is quite a mouthful, replacing NAFTA, which for many, many years provided the rule book, which from most people's perceptions actually worked very well.
Help me understand something, because in the last little while we've had some other good news, not just the USMCA. Mm-hmm. There's been influx from Shell with respect to this LNG facility. So how do we keep that momentum going? It's not just a one-off, this new trade deal and Shell coming in.
I hope that's right. That the next thing that has to be solved is the whole steel and aluminum issue, because those tariffs are still in place and that was not dealt with yet in the USMCA. We have the whole pipeline fiasco, which has to get organized in short order in order for Canadian oil producers to feel that there is some runway there and not just green shoots of optimism, but actual positive movement. And then the other issue, of course, is that we have to see that the world is the marketplace for Canada, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. is and will always be Canada's largest trading partner. So you have to make that bed first before you take care of the rest of the house. We have to know that there is going to be international trade involving countries like China going forward. And of course, that is not a sure thing, because there's been a lot written and spoken about that one of the features of the USMCA is that there's this veto power to be able to veto a country like Canada making a deal with a country like China, that if President Trump and his crew decide that it's not good for American workers, say in Indianapolis, they can veto certain things, and that we lose a little bit of sovereignty there. But to answer your question, I think that we can start to see the ball moving forward, and Canada is starting to take a little piece of this pie, which is this growing GDP across the globe, and we've seen it in the U.S. and say, hey, we want a piece ourselves, and we do seem to be heading in that direction.
Did we expect more from the loonie in the last little while, given this, I guess, good news for Canada?
Let's remember that the loonie, we always price it out to the U.S. CAD, so that we don't really price the loonie against, say, the Swissy franc or against the Aussie dollar. We always think about it in terms of the U.S. dollar. So the first thing to remember is that there are two completely different macro factors which affect the price of U.S. CAD. One is the price of the U.S. dollar relative to all currencies, so that if there's a war in the Middle East, the U.S. dollar will strengthen. Anything bad that happens in the world generally leads to a strengthening of the U.S. dollar against all currencies. And then you have the relative value where something happens in Canada which makes Canadian dollars more in demand around the world, which then increases the value of the Canadian dollar in relation to the U.S. dollar, not in relation to all the currencies of the world. So with that said, we absolutely would have expected a spike, which we saw, upon the announcement that some of this uncertainty has now been removed. Why? Because the rest of the world, mostly Americans, will now have greater demand for Canadian dollars, knowing that they can buy things from Canada without having these massive tariffs placed upon them. But the other thing to remember is that some people use the strength of the Canadian dollar as a proxy for the strength of the Canadian economy. And that would be great if you are traveling to the U.S. and you don't want to pay so much for your trip to Miami in the middle of the winter. Not so great if you're importing from the U.S. If you're selling to the U.S., where the strengthening dollar does not always help you, because if you were collecting U.S. dollars and the Canadian dollar were weaker, you'd be making more profit in Canadian dollars. And so that it really depends who you ask about, is this strong Canadian dollar a good thing or a bad thing, which necessarily means that a strengthening U.S. dollar in itself cannot just be a straight up proxy for the strength of the Canadian economy.
What are some of the broader implications of this new trade deal on our economy?
The biggest implication is that anyone that was thinking about spending, and we've discussed this in the past, anyone who's thinking about spending significant amounts of capital in, for example, the auto sector, would have, or in many different sectors, any of which could have been subjected to tariffs in the absence of a trade deal, can now say, I feel that I have the confidence that the deal as it now is, or as it may become, because it could be shifting beneath our feet, at least I have the confidence that there will be a deal, which means that I can go ahead and invest $50 million in a new plant and go and hire a bunch of Canadian workers so that I can start producing goods that I feel there will be a market for at a reasonable price. That is a tectonic shift, because what we saw over the last year, and I have to, I suppose, give President Trump some credit for knowing how to shake up the snow globe, is that by threatening that we might just remove this deal altogether, and Canada, we might set you adrift on your little ice floe, you saw a complete lack of expenditures of new long-term capital, because in the face of uncertainty, who would risk that kind of capital?
A roadblock that you had mentioned earlier was the fact of these pipelines that still seem to kind of, haunt us, or lack thereof, I should say. You're mentioning the U.S. president, and I guess what comes to mind is our competitive tax rate, which still remains an issue.
It is. And it's funny because for a number of years, the Canadian corporate tax rate was significantly lower, 12 to 15 points lower than that in the U.S., but they fixed that by lowering the U.S. tax rate to 21% and combining that with accelerated depreciation on capital expenditures, which the type of which I was just discussing. And now in Canada, we suddenly find ourselves behind where the U.S. is, because that kind of capital allocation is not rewarded through tax breaks, and also the tax rate itself at 26% is significantly higher than a 21% rate in the U.S. What I've been hearing, and I don't pretend to have any special knowledge on this, but the people on the inside say that the Liberals are finally aware of the fact that while they try and achieve the many things they're trying to achieve, having an environment which is inviting to corporate manufacturing, corporate sales, and capital allocation, creates the kind of optimism required to do what I was just discussing, that at a 21% tax rate, i.e. lowering it from 26 down to where we see it in the US, is quite likely, because Bill Morneau and his team say, if we don't do this, not only might we not go further ahead, we might actually fall further behind, because money is portable, money is fungible. We've discussed this in the past, that people will allocate capital in places that are most favorable to them from the point of view of the market into which they're selling, but also the government to whom they're paying the tax.